Are you a crappy partner, crappy wife, crappy husband, crappy mate? This podcast is for you. Give yourself the gift of self-awareness. Learn new skills. Take the time to assess your partnership, marriage, relationship, etc. So how are we going to do this? Start by taking the Crappy Mate quiz. The quiz can be found on our website, www.crappymate.com, on Pinterest, Crappy Mate, Instagram and Facebook, Crappy Mate Podcast. We will dedicate episodes to discussing the quiz topics. In further episodes, we will be exploring common problems, the speed bumps that occur in relationships. Also, we will introduce time-tested skills and helpful hints to enhance your relationship, and we invite you, our listeners, to contribute your thoughts, questions, or concerns regarding relationships. Welcome to the Crappy Mate Podcast. I'm Dr. Richard Vance Barnes, MD. I'm a board-certified general psychiatrist with 25 plus years in psychiatry. I have treated patients in a variety of settings, both inpatient units, outpatient units, partial hospitalization units, as well as detoxification programs and rehabilitation programs. And I've had a private practice for many, many years.
And I'm Barbara Quaid, a marriage and family therapist. I also have over 25 years experience working with families, individuals, and couples. And my life as a therapist has been both humbling and joyful. Before we get started, I'd just like to talk about our disclaimer. The Crappy Mate podcast is designed to be a useful tool to help individuals and couples have happier and healthier relationships. This podcast is not a substitute for individual or couples therapy, and as always, relationships need to be safe. Seek professional help as needed.
The Crappy Mate podcast was developed out of hearing years and years of stories and accounts from patients in therapy about their mates and themselves actually being crappy mates and poorly behaving within the relationship. And so this concept was then developed into a podcast of how can we help people to actually improve upon their relationships.
And so in order to do this, we developed a quiz. And the quiz, we really thought about some concepts that we thought were important in a relationship. And so the Crappy Mate quiz ended up being a 10-question self-scoring assessment that can be found on our Facebook page. And our Facebook page is aptly named the Crappy Mate Podcast. And along with the quiz, you will find a glossary with the terms we used both in the podcast and on the quiz. And this is so we can all be on the same page. Now, to score the quiz, you will read each question carefully and then ask yourself, do I do this almost always, sometimes, or almost never? And when we thought about this, the scoring is like this. Almost always is worth 3 points. Sometimes 2 points, and almost never 1 point. So once you have your total points, you add them up. And a score of 10 to 17 clearly indicates that one needs improvement. A score of 17 to 24, one has a degree of awareness, but improvement can still be beneficial. And a score of 24 to 30, one is aware, insightful, and acting in a positive manner as it pertains to the relationship.
Welcome to the Crappy Mate Podcast. In today's episode, we continue our series on relationships following the death of a child. We have a very special guest for today's episode. Please join us in welcoming Tamara Gabriel. Tamara Gabriel happens to be my spouse of many years, and she is the founder of Healing Hugs. Tamara founded Healing Hugs after the death of her daughter, Jenna, many years ago. Healing Hugs is a nonprofit that supports parents and families experiencing grief after the death of a child. Tamara, can you tell us more about your story?
In 1997, I had left my husband in March, and we had been separated for a couple months. And in July of 97, my daughter and I were going to visit a friend when my car lost control. and collided with another car on the side where my daughter was sitting. And she was airlifted to a trauma hospital where she remained in a coma for a week before she passed away. I entered another world that I never even imagined was possible. And trying to get through something so traumatic was definitely quite a challenge at the time.
So, in earlier episodes of the Crappy Maid podcast, we've talked about some of the feelings and emotions and behaviors that a person goes through following the death of a child. And so, Tamara, for you, what were some of the feelings, emotions, and behaviors that you went through then and what you go through now?
Back then, I didn't realize, like I said, that my brain could get to that place, having PTSD from the car accident in and of itself, with a lot of anxiety and not wanting to leave my house. And I ended up eventually drinking quite a lot to try to cope with those feelings, because I really wasn't raised to know how to deal with feelings and knew that drinking would help kind of squash them. But after several months, it just wasn't working. At the 8-month mark, I got sober, March of 98.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
How did this affect your relationships, both your relationship with Jenna's father and certainly your relationships in general?
It made the relationship went from worse to worse with the dad. I think he was still punishing me for leaving him. And I think a lot of people blamed me actually for that car accident. I was definitely very sober during that time, but I think people just were very upset with me and my ex at the time, my husband, and my family. Basically, I was pretty alienated from everyone. So it made the grief that much more challenging in my relationships. And I had a couple friends that were there for me that really helped me. And therapy definitely helped me a lot. I was going twice a week for therapy.
You were going twice a week for therapy, but also you went to AA. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I think if it wasn't for AA, I don't know where I'd be today. Just having a community of people to support me means all the difference in the world. And through that process, learning to have acts of service, actually, that made a difference and took me out of myself when I was having really bad days.
So how did you come up with the name Healing Hugs? Because it's really a lovely name. How did that come about?
I'm actually a licensed massage therapist, and touch is one of the number one forms of healing. The idea is to heal, that we can heal from something as traumatic as grief, and not having a lot of people around it, just having a hug was more important than any of the words that anyone could say to me. And I've heard lots of challenging statements being thrown my way. And so I decided to write a poem, and just briefly it stated, that was published in the newspaper, the local newspaper where I lived in New York. And it was, "If you see me, do not run. I know that talk is not much fun. I know your hearts are sure to tug, but all I need is just a hug. But please, for Jenna, just give me a hug," actually, in the end. And people would see me and say, "I read your poem." And to me, that felt so much better than having them say anything to me. Being able to have that healing hug encompasses grief and compassion and empathy, and it also goes across the world. So who doesn't want a good hug when you're having a tough time?
So that really helped, was just having a hug from others.
That's all we need.
And created community for you.
Absolutely, yes.
So what kind of advice do you have for our listeners? And these are listeners who are in a relationship and they've lost a child. Now, what I will also add is probably some of these people lost a child many years ago, or it could be very recent.
I believe in therapy, especially when it's something you have not experienced before, having someone there for you, because couples naturally will go towards anger and resentment and blame, quite honestly, because I really felt a lot of that coming my way. And what we need for each other is more empathy and compassion. So having them on the same page, being able to find ways to keep their child's memory alive, focusing on a solution, and being able to, if possible, come up with some type of act of being able to volunteer. If I could read a quote that was by Barbara Bush, She said, "The death of a child is so painful, both emotionally and spiritually, that I truly wondered if my own heart and spirit would ever heal. I soon learned that I could help myself best by helping others. And it would be amazing if parents could come together. And I'm grateful that my husband, Dr. Barnes, is able to support me in my healing hugs, as well as the grief that I go through during the holidays, during our birthday. Both my children are born on my birthday. And people don't realize it's a bittersweet holiday. And I'm fortunate enough that my husband understands what I go through and is willing to do what I need, especially as moms. And it's not that dads don't go through it, but if we could communicate with one another what our needs are and respect each other's differences, that can go along miles and miles within the relationship and actually help build a bridge in keeping the connection alive with the parents.
Well, you're mentioning something that's really important to us, which is communication.
Yes.
And of course, that's difficult under the best of circumstances, but I would imagine particularly challenging when both parents are experiencing grief.
Oh, without a doubt. And I'm able to at least tell my husband too what I need, which again, he respects it and doesn't say, no, we don't need to do that. We need to do this. He doesn't argue with me. He's able to say, if that's what you need, that's what you need. And you can't argue with someone's need. And sometimes people just need space. Sometimes they need to come together. But again, it's that accepting and talking about it and the willingness to communicate what is going on with the other person rather than shutting down and saying, this is my grief. You both have this child together, and bonding with one another in spite of that loss is something that will help keep that child's memory alive, which is what we want to do. I always appreciate talking about my child, but I do know that couples handle it differently. Togetherness is what will help bring them by talking about what's going on with each of them. And sometimes if they can't talk, they can write something down and have the other partner read it to one another, because sometimes it is difficult to speak. And we don't always have the word or the language for the type of grief we're feeling at that time, especially.
I think that's an important point, that we don't often have the language, that we need to talk about grief. And I think especially in our day and age, we don't talk about grief very often. And you talked about compassion for the other person.
Yeah.
So that's actually being able to get outside of yourself and understand that the other person is also grieving.
100%. That understanding, like I said, would bridge a gap rather than separate, the couples from one another, because they think they do it differently, that there's some kind of battle going on. When it's you do it your way and I'll do it my way, and then we can come together and still celebrate our child in a way that we can honor them by keeping our love alive, by keeping the love for our other children or our family members, and also being able to set boundaries with other relatives, with other family members, because, that gets pulled into the mix too, with couples, is just also the outside family, but they have to be a team. It's important for them to have each other's back no matter what.
So Tamara, how did you end up having compassion for yourself? Because as you said in your story, you were the one that was driving the car when Jenna.
Well, it's interesting. Back then, I vowed to never forgive myself. And I was going to punish myself the rest of my life. And it wasn't really until I got into recovery that really taught me how to learn to forgive myself, that I would do affirmations that I deserve to be happy, I deserve to enjoy life, because I didn't think I was allowed to. And I think sometimes too, that's what parents think too, that they punish themselves and they punish each other during that time too, rather than realizing, yes, their child's gone, they can grieve, but I realized that my daughter would want me to be happy. And the best way I can keep her memory alive is by forgiving myself, because I know that she would want me to do that. And if I do something to hurt myself, then I'm not keeping her memory alive, which is, again, why I started Healing Hugs, to help other parents and come out of myself, volunteering, working with them, helping them through any challenge that they're difficulty, financial or emotional at the time, and spiritually, if they need that as well. is extremely important. But I worked every day that I ate a meal, every day that I took my medications, every day that I exercised and took care of myself, every day was a day of forgiveness for myself. Doesn't mean I don't slip, but I needed to forgive myself in order to go on.
Tamara, thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your story. I think you're going to be an inspiration for others, for our listeners, and certainly for me, you've been an inspiration. But one of the things I just want to recap is when you talk about couples, you talk about communication, you talk about compassion, the need to take care of yourself as well, because that's something I think we forget. We have to take care of ourselves in order to have a healthy relationship.
Well, it shows that you're caring about not just yourself, but the other person, because you want to bring your best self to your partner. I don't want to bring a grief-riddled partner to my husband. I have moments of grief, but I also want to bring my best self because I want him to bring his best self to me as well. And I think that's important. And of course, we all have days. We all have days, and no one's day is worse than the other. Like, I don't want to compete with my husband. I don't want to compete in the relationship because each person, we all have our own feelings. And yes, my grief, yes, the loss of a child is the worst. And again, I appreciate the fact that he as well has empathy and compassion towards me, towards those times when I'm irritable, because that comes up and it's nothing personal. It's just my grief. I'm just getting triggered. And usually when I act out that way, it's not against my partner. It's just against my grief. Usually that's what's always coming up for me.
Thank you, Tamara. And thank you, listeners. And thank you for listening to the Crappy Mate podcast.
In closing the podcast today, I just want to remind our listeners of our disclaimer. The Crappy Mate podcast is designed to be a useful tool to help individuals and couples have happier and healthier relationships. This podcast is not a substitute for individual or couples therapy. And as always, relationships need to be safe. Seek professional help as needed.
Thank you for listening to the Crappy Mate podcast. We invite you to submit comments, questions, and/or concerns about today's podcast, or give us feedback on relationship topics you'd like to hear covered. We encourage you to try our helpful hints. Give these a go, try them on for size. Remember, you can follow us on our Facebook and Instagram pages under the Crappy Mate podcast. Our website is www.crappymate.com. And please be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening.